Axel Walker, a human engineer, stood nervously in the cramped hallway of the Star Destroyer Athena, trying to ignore the bead of sweat trickling down his forehead. He was getting increasingly aware of how quiet it had been for the past few minutes. The ship had been on high alert, with malfunctioning systems cropping up everywhere. Yet, here he was, they were here, about to face something even worse. He clutched his toolkit and mentally prepped himself for what he had to do: share a room. No, scratch that, a bed. With an alien engineer. Axel Walker, a deep, emotionless voice called from behind him. He turned to see Hyra Velmer, the alien engineer. Her lithe, violet-skinned frame towered over him, her eyes glowing softly with an ethereal, almost intimidating intelligence. She had the precision of a machine in every movement, an aura of competence that made Axel feel like a bumbling human idiot. She had barely said a word in their initial meeting earlier that day. She wasn't unfriendly, just too alien. Too perfect. And now, after the room allocation system malfunctioned, they were forced to share the only available quarters. The only available quarters. And that included a bed that could barely fit one person, let alone the two of them. "You've been assigned to share quarters with me," Hyra said, her voice flat, but with a slight undertone of curiosity. "We must make the best of the situation. The ship's systems are too critical for us to waste time on personal discomfort." Axel couldn't help but laugh nervously. "Well, personal discomfort is kind of my specialty." "You sure about this? I mean, this whole bed thing?" Hyra's expression remained stoic. "The ship requires us to collaborate, not debate our sleeping arrangements." He scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Right. Just checking. I mean, we might have to adjust some things to fit, you know? I'm a lot bigger than you. That is a matter of physical dimension, Walker. It is not a problem I foresee." He chuckled nervously again, trying to ignore the rising discomfort. He had read about alien races with various physiological differences, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer presence of Hyra. She was tall, thin, and radiated an air of silent authority. Even as she was clearly just following orders, Axel couldn't shake the feeling that she was light years ahead of him in every way. Yet, here they were, forced to share a tiny bed, his body practically pressed against hers. "I'll take the floor," Axel blurted out, determined to find a way to avoid that level of intimacy. Hyra raised an eyebrow, an imperceptible flash of amusement passing through her eyes. "It is not necessary. We will find a solution." The solution turned out to be as ridiculous as it was uncomfortable. With minimal space in the room and a bed far too small for even one of them, they both had to adjust their positions multiple times. Axel tried making a joke about being the big spoon, but Hyra didn't even respond to the remark, her body language as stoic as ever. "What exactly is your species' obsession with being comfortable all the time?" Axel muttered, squirming under the ridiculous circumstances. "I mean, we're engineers. We fix stuff, right? So why not fix this bed? It's the only one we got, and it doesn't seem too optimal for, well, this." "Optimization is not the problem here," Hyra replied, her tone the same as it had been since she walked into the room. "The issue is your persistence to avoid an easy solution." "An easy solution?" Axel repeated with a half-hearted laugh. "You mean, this? Sharing a bed with a stranger? Sounds like a romantic comedy script to me." Her eyes flickered, but she didn't respond. Axel thought he saw the smallest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to catch on to his humor. Not that it would make him any less awkward. "I suppose you're used to being in command of everything you do, huh?" Axel asked, trying to provoke a little reaction from her. "Control is essential for efficiency," she answered coolly. "Yeah, sure. I get that. But you know what they say, control's overrated. Sometimes a little chaos can lead to unexpected results." Hyra finally glanced at him, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Is that supposed to be an attempt at humor, Walker?" Axel paused, a bit flustered. "I mean, it was funny in my head." But you probably don't get Earth humor. Most aliens don't. Humor is not the issue here, she said, her eyes flickering to the various malfunctioning equipment scattered across their room. We are engineers. We solve problems. If you are incapable of doing that, I suggest you focus on the task at hand instead of unnecessary distractions. Axel grimaced, trying not to take offense. Right. Focus. Got it. I'm not used to this kind of, situational stress. It's a lot, you know? Sharing a bed with you and, He broke off as he tried to make sense of his words. It wasn't like he could just casually flirt with an alien like that. But, he couldn't help it. The whole situation felt absurd. Hira didn't seem bothered. Instead, she began inspecting one of the room's malfunctioning panels, her cool demeanor unfazed by Axel's clumsy attempt at humor. You are overcomplicating things, Walker, she said. I do not require humor to solve problems. Axel sighed dramatically, leaning back into the bed. I think this whole thing's a disaster. Not only are we stuck in here, but I'm trying to work with you. And? Hira interrupted. We are engineers. This is what we do. Yeah, when you're in a situation like this, being stuck together in a bed with an alien who can read me like a book, that's a different kind of pressure, Axel grumbled. Hira's only response was a tilt of her head, an odd look in her eyes. For a moment, Axel thought he might have actually made a breakthrough. Maybe she was starting to understand. Pressure can be managed, Hira finally said. He paused. Yeah, I think I've got it under control. It's just a bit of a tight fit for me. He said the last part with a grin, attempting yet another joke. Hira didn't even flinch at the innuendo, but Axel noticed the faintest shift in her posture, as though she were considering his words. He couldn't tell if she was irritated or intrigued, and that uncertainty made everything feel even more uncomfortable. But for the first time in hours, Axel allowed himself a real smile. Maybe this wasn't so bad after all. They might not be the perfect match, but hell, he could survive this. He just had to keep his jokes to himself for a while. You're right, Axel said finally, breaking the silence. Pressure can be managed. And just like that, they got to work. Axel rubbed his forehead as the blaring alarm from the ship's comm system echoed through the small room. The lights flickered once before stabilizing. He glanced at Hira, who had barely reacted, her calm expression unaffected by the chaos around them. Axel, on the other hand, was more than a little frazzled. It wasn't the cramped quarters or the strange bed-sharing situation that was making him tense anymore, he'd managed to ignore that by now. No, it was the ship's systems that were failing, one by one, and they were the only engineers on board who could fix them. We need to get to the main engine room, Axel said, his voice thick with urgency. If we don't reroute the power to the stabilizers, we'll be in deep space in a matter of hours. Hira nodded without hesitation. Then we should move quickly. She stood up, her tall, elegant figure gliding toward the door. Axel hesitated, glancing at the bed that had become more of a nuisance than a sleeping arrangement. For a moment, the absurdity of it all hit him like a wave. He, a human engineer, stuck in a tiny room with an alien who was both his professional superior and, for the foreseeable future, his forced companion. With a quick shake of his head, Axel grabbed his toolkit and followed Hira down the narrow corridor. They were a strange pair, Axel, a man of human origins, socially awkward and unfiltered, Hira, an alien of exceptional intelligence, calm and precise. Yet despite their differences, they had to figure this out. It wasn't just the bed that was cramped. Their entire professional lives seemed to have been crammed together into this one chaotic situation. As they entered the engine room, Axel's eyes darted to the malfunctioning panels and exposed wiring. Sparks flew from a junction box, and the hum of the engines was irregular. The ship wasn't just falling apart, it was fighting to stay alive. Axel made his way over to the nearest terminal, quickly connecting his interface with the system. Meanwhile, Hira was already assessing the damage with the same detached precision that he'd come to expect from her. Start rerouting power to the lower stabilizers, Axel ordered, trying to hide his panic beneath a layer of professionalism. I already have, Hira responded. The systems are being overloaded. Power surges will only make it worse. Axel frowned, leaning over her shoulder to examine the data she was pulling up on her console. He couldn't help but notice how close they were, how their bodies almost brushed each time she shifted. His thoughts were distracted for a moment, he had to focus. This wasn't the time for weird personal feelings, no matter how insane this whole situation was. Okay, so we need to create a bypass, Axel muttered to himself, pulling up schematics on his screen. We isolate the conduit, and we can siphon the excess power through the auxiliary grids. It'll buy us enough time to fix the core, but we'll need to manually reroute everything, together. Hira's eyes flashed with interest. A human solution, she said, her voice tinged with something like approval. It is unorthodox, but it may work. Unorthodox is kind of my thing, Axel shot back, unable to resist a grin. You might want to watch this. He got to work immediately, pulling wires from the panels and connecting them in ways that Hira's species might have considered inefficient or crude. But to Axel, it was second nature. He was used to thinking on his feet, improvising when things got tight, and right now, things were tight, literally and figuratively. Axel, you are not following the correct protocols, Hira remarked, her cool voice breaking his concentration. This method is risky. I don't do protocols when lives are at stake, Axel snapped, the edge in his voice betraying his growing stress. And right now, the only thing that matters is keeping this ship intact long enough for us to fix it. He barely had time to finish before another power surge sent the lights flickering again. The room's temperature spiked, and Axel could feel the heat rising in his chest as the engine's core struggled to stay stable. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he yanked a control lever, rerouting power through the backup conduits. Sparks shot out from another terminal as a piece of equipment exploded. Axel ducked instinctively, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Hira didn't flinch, but she was already ahead of him, pressing a series of buttons on her console. The surge is too great. If we do not stabilize the core in the next 10 minutes, the entire system will collapse. 10 minutes? Axel echoed, feeling his pulse race. He could feel the pressure mounting. This was it, the point of no return. There was no time for second guesses, no time for hesitation. He had to focus. Yeah, well, no pressure, Axel said through gritted teeth. We've only got 10 minutes to save everyone aboard this ship. Do not waste time on humor, Hira remarked flatly, her hands moving deftly over her console as she began inputting the rerouting codes. We do not have time for such distractions. Axel's heart skipped a beat at the words. She was right, of course. The humor, the innuendo, the awkwardness between them, it all had to go. They were engineers. And in this moment, nothing mattered except keeping the ship alive. Got it, Axel said, snapping back to work. He kept his head down and focused, hands moving quickly over the control panels as he worked in sync with Hira. Their teamwork, once awkward and strained, began to flow seamlessly. Each movement, each adjustment, was deliberate and efficient. As much as Axel hated to admit it, Hira was incredible. Her calm presence was exactly what he needed right now. The countdown in his mind was ticking down as he rerouted the excess power. Sparks flew from an exposed conduit, but Axel didn't flinch, he was too focused. The last few seconds felt like hours. He glanced at Hira, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. There was no time for words, but he could see the respect there. They were doing this, together. And then, the power stabilized. Axel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The room, now quieter, felt cooler as the engines hummed back to life. The ship wasn't out of the woods yet, but they had a chance. We did it, Axel said, a grin finally breaking through the tension. That was a hell of a fix. Hira's expression softened, just slightly, though she still maintained her calm demeanor. You are a skilled engineer, Axel Walker. He felt a strange warmth spread through him at her words. He had been hoping for something like that, but hearing it from her felt like a small victory in itself. "Thanks," Axel said quietly, feeling a little embarrassed by the weight of the moment. "You're not so bad yourself." The awkwardness that had hung between them earlier still lingered, but in the chaos of saving the ship, it seemed a little less important now. "We still have work to do," Hira reminded him. "The core is still unstable. But we have bought ourselves time." "Right," Axel replied, giving her a nod. "Let's finish what we started." And as they returned to their work, the partnership that had begun with awkward tension had evolved into something unexpectedly efficient. There was still a lot to do, but Axel felt a strange sense of accomplishment. They'd made it through this crisis, and for the first time, he thought maybe, just maybe, they could make it through anything. Together. Axel worked swiftly, his fingers flying over the control panel in front of him as the ship's systems flickered and hummed ominously. They had fixed the power surge, but now, the ship was still reeling from the consequences. A slow, tense pressure was mounting in Axel's chest. His eyes flicked back to Hira, who was quietly analyzing the data as if she was reading a manual instead of dealing with a failing ship. He could hear the sounds of her tapping on the interface, her calm, efficient manner in obvious contrast to his increasingly frantic movements. Axel was used to working under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't just a technical problem, it was personal. They were in this mess together, trapped on the ship, and Axel couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes had somehow gotten higher. "Hira, we need to reroute the auxiliary power through the secondary engines," Axel said, his voice strained but still clear. "If we don't, we'll risk a total system failure." She glanced at him without skipping a beat. "The auxiliary power systems are already engaged. We must engage the primary thrusters manually to maintain stability. Rerouting them through the secondary engines will cause irreparable damage." Axel shot her a look. "Irreparable damage? We're already on the brink of disaster. If we don't do something, we'll be floating in space." Hira's eyes met his, and for the first time in their brief partnership, Axel saw a flicker of something, was it irritation, in her gaze. "You fail to understand the magnitude of the risk," she said, her voice clipped. "Then what's your suggestion?" Axel snapped, frustrated. "I'm open to ideas here." Hira inhaled deeply, her features softening ever so slightly. "You are too focused on quick fixes. We need to think through the solution, not rush." Axel exhaled sharply, frustrated by the lack of clarity. He knew she was right about the dangers of rushing through the repair. But this was more than just fixing something, it was survival. The weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders as he glanced back at the flickering systems. The engine core was still unstable, and time was running out. "Okay," Axel said, his voice low. "We need a solution that buys us more time, not a band-aid fix." "Agreed," Hira replied with surprising cooperation. "I will begin restabilizing the engine core manually. You handle the systems that control the backup power." Axel nodded. There was a quiet understanding between them now, despite the tension that still lay in the air. They weren't quite friends, but in this moment, they had to trust each other. They had no choice. Axel stepped over to the control panel, pulling up the system's diagram. His mind raced as he analyzed the configuration. The more he looked, the more obvious it became, if they didn't isolate the overloads, they would end up triggering another full system crash. They'd already gone through one surge. Another could wipe everything out. "Got it," Axel muttered, bringing up a complex series of commands. "I'll reroute the excess load here." He input the final series of commands just as the ship's warning lights flashed red. The warning alarms went off again, and this time, they were louder and more urgent. Axel could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his body instinctively going into overdrive. Hira stood silent beside him, the only movement being the slight tilt of her head as she observed the data, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. Axel's mind raced. If they didn't get this right, if one of them made a mistake, they would lose the ship. And everyone aboard it. "How's it looking on your side?" Axel asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. Stabilizing, Hira replied succinctly, her voice cool and professional, but Axel could sense the underlying tension in her tone. You need to stabilize the external power conduits. The load is too heavy on the primary systems. Axel cursed under his breath. He'd forgotten about the external conduits. That was a major oversight. It would take time to reconfigure, time they didn't have. But he had no choice. He turned toward the external panel, where the power conduits were sparking erratically. Shit, Axel muttered. This isn't good. Hira looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. You are wasting time with that exclamation. Focus on the task at hand. Axel knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier to keep his cool. He worked quickly, rerouting the conduits, his hands moving with precision as he made the necessary adjustments. But as soon as he finished, the entire system buckled again. The conduits began sparking violently, and the hum of the engines grew more erratic. Come on, come on. Axel muttered, frustration mounting. His heart raced, but he couldn't afford to panic. Hira was already several steps ahead, but Axel still felt like he was playing catch-up. Do not hesitate, Hira said calmly, her eyes never leaving the data streaming in front of her. You must focus. Axel nodded, his hands shaking as he tried again. This time, as his fingers clicked over the controls, the surge of energy stabilized. The ship's systems didn't flicker. Instead, they hummed to life, their usual steady rhythm returning. Axel didn't have time to celebrate. He moved quickly to the next panel, rerouting more power as he double-checked every connection. A sense of relief flooded through him as the ship's systems stabilized. He could hear the hum of the engines returning to their normal, steady rhythm. His breathing slowed, but the tension didn't completely dissipate. They weren't out of danger yet. But this was the first real step toward survival. Hira looked at him briefly, her eyes assessing his work. You did well, she said, her voice almost approving. Axel gave a short nod, his expression hard to read. I'm not done yet. There was a moment of silence between them, one that seemed to stretch on forever. The air felt thick with both exhaustion and the residue of an unspoken understanding. Axel and Hira had worked together, not as a perfect team, but as two people desperate to keep the ship intact. We'll need to recheck the core before we move forward, Hira said, already shifting to the next task. It's the most vulnerable part of the ship. Axel looked over at her, seeing her concentration, her unwavering focus. Despite everything, despite the awkwardness of their shared quarters, despite their conflicting personalities, he realized something. Hira wasn't just an alien engineer. She was a damn good one. Got it, Axel replied. Let's finish this. Together, they moved toward the next task, the urgency of the situation propelling them forward. The ship's pulse steadied, but there was still work to do. As they both dove back into the systems, Axel couldn't help but feel a strange sense of respect for the alien engineer. She was the one person on this ship who didn't break under pressure. And despite everything, despite the awkwardness of their forced proximity, Axel knew he couldn't have asked for a better partner in this situation. Not now. Not ever. Ready? Axel asked, glancing at Hira. Always, she replied, her calm voice reassuring. And together, they dove deeper into the ship's core, ready to fix the next problem. Axel exhaled sharply, his eyes glued to the malfunctioning panel in front of him. The ship's systems were still showing signs of instability, and despite their best efforts, the clock was ticking. Every second they wasted now was a second closer to catastrophic failure. The pressure was suffocating, but Axel couldn't afford to show it. Not with Hira working next to him, cool and composed as ever. Status update, Axel called out, his hands moving swiftly across the control panel as he inputted a sequence of diagnostic commands. Engine core stabilizing, Hira responded without looking up, her voice a quiet contrast to the chaos around them. But it will only hold for so long. The primary systems are already compensating for the strain. We must recalibrate the thrusters before we lose full control. Axel nodded. Understood. I'll reconfigure the propulsion systems. You handle the core, and we can sync everything after. Hyra's sharp gaze flickered toward him. There was no visible sign of doubt in her expression, but Axel could tell she was calculating, weighing the risks of splitting their focus. He wasn't sure if she was considering the potential outcome of trusting him, but he could sense the slight hesitation before she nodded. Agreed. Proceed. Axel got to work immediately, his hands flying over the console as he initiated the reconfiguration sequence. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were running out of time. It wasn't just about the ship anymore. The lives of everyone aboard depended on their ability to pull this off. As he inputted the commands, the ship's systems flashed warnings in rapid succession. Another power surge. Axel's heart pounded in his chest. He quickly redirected the flow of energy through the auxiliary channels, but it wasn't enough. The surge hit again, this time stronger. The lights flickered and dimmed, and the hum of the engines faltered. Damn it! Axel cursed, slamming his fist against the panel. We're not going to make it at this rate. We will, Hyra said simply, still working with unwavering precision. You just need to recalibrate the core's backup systems. We cannot keep relying on auxiliary power. It will overload. Axel clenched his jaw, frustration gnawing at him. He knew what she was saying was true. They were running out of options, and every minute they spent trying to avoid the inevitable only made it harder. He glanced over at Hyra, her eyes focused, her mind 1,000 steps ahead of him, and something in him clicked. This wasn't about winning. It was about survival. And to do that, they had to trust each other completely. Right. Let's do it, Axel said, voice steadying. I'll adjust the grid. You adjust the core. Hyra barely nodded, but Axel could sense that she understood. Together, they attacked the problem from opposite ends, her alien expertise complementing his unorthodox approach. Every motion, every word, was synchronized, there was no room for errors. The hum of the engines grew louder, a steady pulse that seemed to echo their hearts as they worked in unison. As Axel rerouted the energy grid for the last time, the ship's systems started to respond. Slowly, the flickering lights steadied. The alarms quieted. For a moment, everything was still. The control panel in front of Axel displayed the vital signs of the ship, a steady stream of data scrolling across the screen. They had done it. Core stabilization complete, Hyra announced, her voice tinged with the faintest hint of satisfaction. You have successfully recalibrated the propulsion systems. Axel leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was fleeting. They weren't out of danger yet. The ship was alive, but barely. And the fact that they had managed to work together, despite all the tension, was the only reason they'd made it this far. Good work, Axel said, letting out a slow breath. We're not out of the woods, but we've bought ourselves some time. Hyra's expression softened ever so slightly, but she didn't smile. It was not a perfect solution, she remarked, her tone still as clinical as ever. But it will suffice, for now. Axel couldn't help but grin. It was an odd compliment, but it was the closest thing to approval that Hyra had given him. Guess that's the best I'm gonna get from you, Axel joked, trying to lighten the mood. Hyra glanced at him, her gaze unreadable. You do not need approval to succeed, Axel Walker, she said coolly. You need only results. He chuckled, more to himself than anything. Guess we're both in the same boat, huh? Hyra didn't respond, but Axel noticed the smallest flicker of something in her eyes, maybe recognition, maybe something more. It wasn't much, but it was something. He didn't know why, but it felt like a breakthrough. All right, Axel said, pulling himself together. Now we just need to deal with the aftershocks. I'll run diagnostics on the auxiliary engines while you make sure the core's stable. Hyra nodded. Proceed. They fell into a comfortable rhythm again, working side by side. Axel could almost forget the cramped quarters, the tension, the awkwardness. They were engineers, this was what they did. And for the first time since their forced partnership began, Axel didn't feel quite so out of place. The hours stretched on as they worked through the ship's systems, recalibrating and rerouting power wherever necessary. The alarms quieted, and the ship's systems began to hum with a renewed energy. But Axel could tell that the relief was only temporary. There was still a long way to go before they could call it a success. The ship wasn't fully stable yet. As the last of the diagnostics cleared, Axel let out a long sigh. "All right, Hira. We've done all we can for now. The ship's systems are holding. I think we can breathe for a minute." Hira straightened, her face as composed as always. "We have delayed the inevitable. The ship requires more repairs than we can handle at this moment." Axel grinned, relieved despite the grim reality of her words. "I'll take delayed the inevitable as a win for today." Hira gave him the slightest nod, an acknowledgement of his effort, but nothing more. He had learned by now that this was as close to a compliment as she ever gave. "Let's get to the next task," Hira said. "The systems will fail again if we do not continue monitoring." Axel followed her lead, his mind already jumping to the next task. As they moved on to the next round of repairs, Axel couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed between them in such a short time. The awkwardness was still there, but the tension had shifted. They were a team now, whether they liked it or not. "You know," Axel said, glancing at Hira as they worked. "I never expected to be working with someone like you." Hira's eyes flickered toward him, and for a brief moment, Axel thought he saw something in her expression, something human. "I am sure you did not," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. Axel smiled, a little surprised at the change. "Guess we're not so different after all." Hira didn't answer, but as they continued their work, Axel knew he wasn't the only one who had changed.